Good evening, everyone. My name is Charlotte Guest, and on behalf of the Geelong Libraries, I'm delighted to be hosting tonight's event with Evelyn Araluen, discussing her latest book, The Rot. Before we start, a huge thank you must go to the Stella Prize for partnering on this event and bringing Evelyn to our region to share her work with Geelong readers. The Stella Prize not only does essential work elevating literature written by women and non-binary writers in Australia, but is also one of the few prizes that takes a truly democratic approach to genre. And as a result, it's raised the profile of poets and, as of this year, graphic novelists in the literary consciousness of the country. To properly introduce Evelyn Araluen is a Guri and Koori poet, editor and researcher. She is a lecturer at the Willan Centre for Indigenous Arts and Cultural Development, a co-editor of Overland Literary Journal, and a chairperson for the board of the Institute of Postcolonial Studies. She's also the author of two collections, Dropbear and The Rot, which have either been shortlisted or won so many literary prizes that I won't list them here tonight because we'll be here until 12. But importantly for tonight's chat, it's worth mentioning that Dropbear won the 2022 Stella Prize and The Rot was shortlisted for this year's award. So thank you, Evelyn, for being here with us tonight. I've heard you speak elsewhere about how you came to writing poetry through learning Bundjalung and how learning language unhinged English and empire from your mind. So perhaps we can start our conversation there. Could you tell us a bit about how Bundjalung opened up poetry as a form for you?
Yeah, of course. Dingiwala Nadina Evelyn. Thank you so much. What a beautiful welcome. Oh my God, I'm chuffed, and also incredibly honoured to be here in your incredibly fancy building. You guys have such a nice library. Oh my God, this is very, very impressive. And yeah, just really, really honoured to be down here in Wadawurrung country and to take this drive down, knowing that this water was with me that whole way, and that this is a place that I'm still learning, I'm still learning my sense and place in the Kulin Nations. And so just really honoured to be deepening that through all of these experiences and encounters, which brings me back to this kind of question of finding poetry through Bundjalung language, which really like in such an explicit and naked way, that began in a classroom down at Eora College, the Aboriginal TAFE in Redfern, where I was sitting down with the beautiful late Drew Roberts, who walked my sister and I through not just language and the language of our great-grandfather, a language that had been spoken in our family for over 100 years up until that point, walk through these philosophies that structured language, and it absolutely just broke my brain. So thinking about grammar as being ordered not by the centrality of the human subject, as it often is in English, the subject-verb-object order that gets drilled to you in high school in terms of emphasising the clarity of speech and really centering a human agent who acts and creates an effect in their world. In Bundjalung, land is centred. Land has to come first and the place has to come first, and that is the dominant structuring force in a sentence. And I spent time thinking about that and thinking about the implications of learning not just that language but also that philosophy in a different place. What at first felt like the wrong place, and that was a big struggle for me, just in terms of negotiating the reality of a diasporic Aboriginal identity. So I grew up in Western Sydney, very much in like a really beautiful, thriving Aboriginal community that had been made up of so many different family groups who had come in from other parts of the state as the missions and reserves were sort of gradually effectively closing down throughout those periods. And so you had suburbs like Mount Druitt and Shalvey Redfern as well. Sitting alongside other places like, say, the Hawkesbury, where I grew up, that was full of these old black families that had often still culture and language, but it had to keep it so suppressed and secret in order to survive the annihilating systems of settler colonialism and extractive capitalism. So I was really, really proud of coming from that community, and learning language helped not just, with this craft aspect of the formal aspect of thinking about language and thinking about what I wanted to do back to the English language that, I was now realising had infiltrated so many parts of my brain in ways that I'd never previously considered, but how I wanted to actually articulate my sense of life and self. So poetry helped me, in the first poem that I ever wrote, learning Bundjalung on Tharawal, because I didn't grow up on Tharawal country. I was dating a boy who lived down there. It's as good of a reason of any to write poetry, probably. But everything Drew would be talking to me about the topographic relationship between speech and place. So in Bundjalung, we have a lot of our intonation rises and falls quite a lot because it is hill country and that movement. And I started practicing how those words sounded in Tharawal country, which is very similar topographically, and actually has deep, long, historic marriage lines all through the coast. So it was just a really beautiful and interesting place and time to be learning poetry for that experience.
There was a conversation that you had with Tony Birch after the publication of Dropbear.
You have done your homework, Charlotte.
In which you said this phrase, how does a sentence reflect a philosophy, which I thought was just this beautiful, capture of what you were talking about there. And then with Sophie G, who chairs the Stella Prize, she made the point that English is a language that has swallowed so much of other languages, and as a function of imperialism and colonisation, that it has lost all sense of place because it's globalised and expansive and extractive by nature, which is in contrast, of course, to the philosophies of Bundjalung grammar, which I thought was a really fascinating point in terms of how does even, a structure of a sentence where you put what comes first hint at a worldview or reveal a worldview.
Yeah, and I mean, it's not just dialects. So there's 16 different dialects of Bundjalung, and this is quite typical of different Aboriginal language groups. But when we think of English in the age of the internet, and I've been reading Ian McEwan's new novel, which is very strange, and it's looking at this period of time from the perspective, 300 years in the future, from the perspective of a literary historian. And I'm like, you think that job's going to exist in 300 years? That is ambitious. But it's incredibly darling reading speculative fiction from someone who I think is a lot more optimistic about the future than most of us really should be. But he talks about the era in which the internet froze language, and English being frozen by the globalisation of the internet, meaning that at this, in the perspective of this literary historian, this is the period in which the intricacies of dialects and accents and the specificities, we were just in the green room before having a bit of a yarn about how your international publishers are trying to be like, oh, can we change? Can we say that this person went and got gas, not fuel? All of these sorts of things that are they sit so uncomfortably in the mouth, right?
This is for a manuscript called The Kookaburra as well. So you think that they would be able to take the Australian sort of nature of it, but no, it was, can we change bitumen to asphalt? It was like, no, you can't.
And I think it's important to hold the ground on that, because we actually do lose so much knowledge and specificity of place if we if we stop speaking the words that are so known and familiar, and even I think about the funny little familial lexicons, you know, like I talk to my nieces and nephews and the words that they use and how we use those words back for them, even though they're complete nonsense words, but they show a relationship. And Aboriginal languages show the relationship to country, because we are taught that the language has been given to us by country, and you learn it from listening to country. And so it's meant to be spoken on country. And so that's why it's just so beautiful to hear these languages being spoken and sung, because, you know, I often think about how quiet and lonely it must feel for a place to not be able to hear things that it can understand. And so, yeah, I'm anti-globalism. Maybe I'm anti the internet. I don't know. Hard to say.
There is a lot of the internet in a book that is anti-internet, but in a critical engagement with the internet, of course.
A love-hate relationship.
A love-hate relationship, which we will actually talk about in a moment. But maybe if we zone in on the rot specifically, you mentioned in the back of the book that there's a note in which you say that you composed most of these poems over the preceding 2 years amid deep grief, mourning and profound rage. And so I was wondering if you could take us into that period of the composition of the book.
Yeah, I think if I look back on the deranged archive of my camera roll on my phone, which I often do in this strange self-archiving manner, is probably narcissism. I'm not really sure. So 2022, let's take us back to 2022. Dropbear's been out for like a year. I win the Stella Prize, which was crazy because, and this is not a false humility, but the Stella Prize didn't accept poetry. That was not a form that the Stella Prize was interested in. And also, poetry in this country historically has rarely been centred or celebrated in the way that I feel that it is becoming now, it's a really incredible transformation to have seen over the last couple of years. But it's so recent and it's so new. And the Stella Prize has this incredible effect of pushing work out into a mainstream, sometimes a mainstream that it wasn't actually written for or intended for. And so while that was, you know, something that created like a lot of joy and honour for me, especially through the schools program, where I was able to go and speak to young people who were reading my book and saying like, hey, this is making me like poetry, and like this is making me think that I can read poetry. And that is just like, you know, when like a teenage girl tells you that, it's just like, oh my God, like this is the coolest I will ever be in my life. And that was really just so powerful and affirming. But I didn't really know how to say no to things. And so I just agreed to do so much publicity. And that it wasn't just about the subject of the work. It was also about the form of poetry itself. And suddenly I was just constantly having to engage in conversations. It was essentially like justifying the value of poetry, a form that I still felt really new to. And I feel like a lot of Dropbear was me trying to articulate my own, like work through some of my own resentment for Australian poetry. So I felt like this really dishonest inheritor of a tradition that I didn't necessarily think that I could actually validate or defend, and yet I was being called to defend it. So it was a really weird place to be in, and I was approaching rapidly what I didn't identify at the time was burnout because of how much I was working and doing all of that stuff. And I got COVID when my auntie died, and she was the matriarch, Auntie Gloria Matthews, and she was like this matriarch of our family. And she was, I think, 93 when she passed. She was born in Kamargunja, and had been living in all of these different missions throughout New South Wales, and just held this incredible wealth of stories and knowledges and languages. And she she was one of the two aunties that like sat my dad down when he was trying to work out, you know, his family and understand the story of the removals in his lineage and try to understand who he was. And she was one of those elders that sat him down and was like, you know, well, we know who you are and we know who your family, you know. So the fact that I even have identity and like a language to crawl myself back to is because of, in so many ways, was because of her. And I couldn't go to her funeral because I had COVID, and I was like I went into the heaviest, deepest, most deranged, dehydrated, COVID-induced grief, like watching a live stream of a funeral that felt like, you know, just this age was being eclipsed right in front of my eyes. And that unfortunately started this domino effect of, you know, we lost Auntie Gloria, then Uncle Wesman, who was 103 when he passed, a Bigambal elder who, again, he and my dad, like, he was like a grandfather to all of my siblings, and he was just such a powerful storyteller and poet. He wrote a beautiful book of poetry that he'd been, you know, like that was like something like 60 years or something like that. He'd been writing poetry. And then Uncle Greg Sims. And like, you know, when there were so many of them that I lost in that really intense period, it feels trite to kind of like talk about how each of them was so important, but they were all universes. And then the last one was we lost Drew, my language teacher. And that grief, that personal grief, that familial grief that sort of unhinges you from a universe was happening alongside watching a genocide unfolding on my phone and feeling incredibly powerless to act, but still continuing through burnout and, you know, like there was like a legitimate, like organised campaign to get me and my partner fired, to get our Overland Literary Journal deregistered as a charity. You know, we lost $200,000 worth of funding as a consequence of those campaigns because of our advocacy on Palestine. So I look back on that time and I was like, wow, the fact that I was like going to work feels impressive. Like I feel like I could have been a little gentler with myself, but I wasn't coping particularly well. And instead of getting therapy, I decided to aggressively write poetry in the bath. And that's the rot. Don't do that. Like I have to, like I've done some workshops on like my poetic practice and stuff, and people like really well-meaningly are like, oh yeah, we'd like you to talk to some school students about like how you write poetry. And I'm like, I don't think that's legal. Like I don't think I can actually know. So we're going to have to do something else. Yeah, and I mean, it didn't necessarily resolve anything, but I've got this like fierce, adamant insistence in my head, and it's something that that my co-editor and also legal husband, Jonathan Dunk, wrote when we first took on the job at Overland, and it was in the 2019-2020 bushfires, and we were like literally watching the world burning around us, and he said, you know, what we will try to advocate to change what we can change, and what we can't change we will witness. And that is what I thought I was maybe doing, but I was writing poetry and crying in the bath. Yeah.
That leads me to my next question, which is the fact that these poems, they do bear witness to the nightmare of the present moment. And you hosted a session at the Melbourne Writers' Festival last year, which was called The Writer as Witness. And you asked your guests the question, what does it mean for a writer to bear witness? And I wanted to ask this same question of you. What is the responsibility of poetry to reflect the truth of the world we're in? And what power does it have to change that world? What are your reflections on this question a year after that panel that you hosted?
I think it's probably good that I'll never feel settled with my answer to that question, and that it feels something that always requires working through. I think witnessing is incredibly important and vital, and I think often of Amitov Ghosh and the Great Derangement and his writing, or his theorising around the role of craft and literature and artistry in the period that we're in, which he describes as being a period of great derangement as we face impending climactic collapse, and we're all just walking around acting as if everything's normal and fine, which is of course an absurd generalisation. And I've been in Tasmania a few days ago, and just the amount of like incredibly beautiful local people who are just telling me about all the work they're doing in their backyard to fight for like a family of lorikeets, or like a single possum that they've seen, you know, going along their fence. So there is so much beauty in the individual action that's never captured and never really truly witnessed or celebrated in the same way that like the arbitrary meritocracy of the publishing industry, you know, what that valorises. But you know, I do feel profoundly that all artistry should have like a responsibility to be truthful to the times, and that was what Amitov Ghosh said, that, you know, like every novel has to tell this story. Like if you want to make art, you have to make art that says very, very clearly we know what is happening, and, you know, this is how we feel about it. We are not settled and easy and complacent about it. We are aware, we are conscious. And so that bears heavily on me, I think. Like, I don't think you really can make art right now without it in some way being just so brutally conscious of the realities of the circumstances that we're working through. I think it would be trite and irresponsible, and I think if you want to make things that are nourishing and distracting, you can do that, but it has to be a part of this broader ecology of that's something that we do to look after each other so that we can keep participating in the meaningful work and the material work, which is making these annihilating systems harder to do their business as usual, which is to annihilate. So I feel like, you know, I don't have to write poetry. I'm not somebody who like needs, or like if I need to write, I perhaps don't necessarily need to share it, but it is something that, you know, I had this crazy experience with Dropbear where it got read by more than 4 people. Astonishing. To this day, I don't think those more than 4 people includes my parents. My mum did tell me very early on, with disapproval in her voice, you know, it doesn't rhyme. And I was like, well, no, that's true. She used to be an English teacher, curiously enough, but that's fine. But, you know, going from having, you know, the expectations of a poetry book that I had for Dropbear, which was that, you know, I was hoping that some people would read it, and then it got read by way more people than poetry normally gets read by, and it entered into a conversation about like, hey, maybe poetry is this thing that we can do in this country, which was really, really cool. And young people tell me that they want to write poetry now, which is gorgeous and astounding and terrifying and beautiful. So I felt very conscious that had to translate into something. I had sworn off writing more poetry, and then it pulled me back in, like some kind of horrible abusive lover. Yeah, it's really hard to not sound like a complete egomaniac to say this, but when you know that you probably will have an audience, even if what you write is terrible, just because people brand recognition, I suppose, it does something in your brain about thinking about the responsibility that you then have to do something useful with that platform. And, you know, I'm not trying to martyr myself here, but I was very moved by the experience of hearing from young people about reading my work, and it felt it felt selfish not to attempt to do something useful with that, given the opportunity.
There was a comment in that conversation with Tony Birch that I referenced earlier, which sort of ties into this same topic, which was that creative work has a responsibility to record, because if it doesn't, then history can be rewritten, as in it would allow for this idea that nobody saw and nobody knew. It's also really important, I think, to emphasise that this work is a work of radical hope. It's a collection that's dedicated to my girls and the world that you will make. And it refers in many different poems to this idea of the long future, which is a concept developed by Unana professor Eve Tuck. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about this idea of the long future, perhaps both Tuck's definition briefly of it and then your vision for it as you bear it out in the book.
Yeah, so when I was doing my PhD, I was looking at the work of the incredible Nanak philosopher, brilliant genius, Eve Tuck, who is most prominently known for this incredibly transformational work they wrote with Kei Wen Yang called Decolonization is Not a Metaphor. And it's about this insistence that the work of challenging empire can't be symbolic alone, like it can't be metaphoric alone. And things like storytelling and narrative are really important, but they cannot be the only work, which is so true and so moving. But I found that initially really paralysing, and it impacted my relationship with creative practice profoundly for a few years until I was able to work through the power of that sentiment and what it means for the work that we all have to do collaboratively. And that relates very much to what Tony was saying, that that history is so precious and actually so malleable, unfortunately, and we're seeing that unfolding constantly before our eyes in media. So it's really easy to end up in places of despair when you think about the unattainability of like a decolonial future. But Eve Tuck is the first person that I really encountered who just built a language that I could understand that with. So she talks about the long future as being the time after colonisation has ended. She doesn't necessarily go into what that must look like, but she thinks about the regeneration of language, the continuing of cultural practices and knowledges that have resided in the land since time immemorial and that are still there and can still be nourished. And so the long future is kind of this promise that we have to hold hold ourselves accountable to, that we will keep building towards that futurity and we will keep making that world, knowing that even if we are not the ones that will survive into it, the next generation will, or the next generation after. And that was a really profoundly moving experience for me, especially when my siblings started having kids. And as somebody who was like, paralysed by that millennial kind of, I can't have a child because then I'll have to watch the world burn around it and, blah, 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 which is the self-martyring complex of that. It's not to say that that's not a real terror, but the world needs to be so... The world needs children and needs to celebrate children and centre them so much more. And Eve Tuck has this phrase about... I need revolution, but I also need time to bathe my children. And that's such a powerful sentiment, I think, about the ways that we need to understand collective action and community care, and this insistence that it's going to take all of us and it's going to take everything. It's going to take books of poetry and it's going to take blockading oil pipelines, these are all systems that need to be challenged and reimagined for the future that we all deserve to have and need to build and need to be creating. And so I was very consciously thinking about how transformative it had been for me to have this language put in my mouth of like, no, there will be a long future. It's going to be longer than the time of colonisation. It's going to be longer than the time of global imperialism and extractive capitalism. That's going to survive. To have that imagined so clearly for me made me think like, okay, so what can I visualise? What can I describe in a way that might resonate with a younger audience who's probably fairly miserable right now and might need something to look forward to? And that sounds like a terrible summary of this book, because it does not land like that. But that was what I tried to do. This was as good as I was going to be able to get it under the circumstances.
There were so many lines in the book that chimed, like bells when you come across them, and I hope it's not irritating for me to keep quoting you back to you. But one of them that speaks to the topic of this question was about the long future being part praxis, part hope. The long future is a promise to outlive the colony and to restore what was taken from the world to build it. And there are a few different poems that touch on this and on the work of Eve Tuck. And there's another one that I wanted to chat about, which is called On Desire. And desire is a concept that Eve Tuck writes a lot about, as well as another thinker that you draw on, Frederick Jameson, and weave into this specific poem. And this sort of opened up this whole, praxis for me as a reader, where desire becomes a framework through which to understand history and reshape the present. I guess praxis is the best word. And so I wondered if you could talk about how desire in your poems as well becomes a way of speaking. It becomes a mode of inquiry and like a lens to look through. It was such a beautiful and new encounter with the idea of desire, for me at least, as a reader. Yeah,
and that's the same experience I had with Eve Tuck. So she talks, to quote her, desire is involved with the not yet and at times the not anymore. And when she says involved, that's such a crucial word because she sees so much complexity when she talks about all of these different forces and energies and drives kind of intermingling and competing with each other. She's very interested in the power of refusal, especially when it comes to Indigenous communities. So she talks a lot about how, there's so much power in saying, we don't need research as an intervention. We don't need institutions to decide that they're going to save us. Sometimes we need to remember that we hold power in our own communities. And she talks about this need to resist the assumption that awareness is change. So it's very common kind of like activist logic that's, always talking about like building awareness and raising awareness. Looking at charities that are like, we're going to raise awareness of breast cancer, for example. But if you're not then channeling that funding into research and into, medical systems, you can be very aware of something, but you're unable to actually change it. So she looks at this logic in terms of like the deficit narrative surrounding Indigenous communities, saying maybe awareness isn't going to be the thing that actually helps us. Maybe it's centering and locating our own power and just deciding that we are the ones who can change things that need to be changed. And that is where desire comes in. She says like we have to desire what is good for us and what nourishes us and what restores us. And that was so transformational for my thinking, that desire can be something that propels us away from harm and away from wounds and towards like each other, towards relationships that strengthen each other and strengthens our connections to the land and to our own futurity. And it caused me to actually like have to like go back and like untangle my own understanding of desire, not just like this kind of like, I guess, more like sociological or cultural or political lens of desire, but also to think about desire like in the context of embodiment. the erotic around desire, and just like start to attempt to analyse some of my own fairly weird relationships with that stuff. And so I write trying to work through some of that. And Frederick Jamison, was really powerful for me there, to just quote him. History is what hurts, it is what refuses desire and sets inexorable limits to individual as well as collective praxis. So history refusing desire, like history refusing the human things that draw us to what we need and to what we want, with these grand narratives that like organise things by events and not by feeling. And if I go back and look at the history of like my life and my encounters with the world and with other humans simply through the body, that tells a very different story to the one that actually sits inside like my memories or inside my nervous system. And so the poems about desire were an opportunity for me to negotiate those two parameters of like myself in history and myself in the body, and kind of just work out like that I do not know what's going on up here, frankly. So I had like case studies. I'm like, okay, well, how did I learn some of these parameters, or how were some of these parameters of desire, both historically and physically embodied for me? Like, how did I learn these things? And it's like, yes, movies and TV. That will be, that is how I learned things, right? So yeah, there's a working through of that, but my understanding of these concepts is not finished, I would probably say, and that topic, especially in this book, was definitely more of like opening a door and perhaps not walking into the room, but at least opening the door, getting started with the process.
Maybe the next book is stepping into the room of the door that has been opened by the rot.
I think not. I think I'll close the door. I think I've seen enough of what's in there to know that's probably fine. That's somebody else's.
Let's shut the door.
Yeah, I actually think a bit of repression is good.
There was this brilliant article by Eve Tuck called Breaking Up with Deleuze, the philosopher Deleuze, where she talks about, or they talk about, desire as a form of intelligence, that desire is smart, it moves towards something, and that is a form of knowing, and we should try to understand that what is ineffable about desire can be unpacked. And that was a real light bulb moment for me when I was reading the book and looking at some of the huge amount of thinkers that you draw on to inform the ideas of the rot. There's a reading list at the back of the book to give readers a sense of all the different sources, not just books, but video essays, albums, discographies that you draw on to infuse the rot with this intertextuality and all these voices. It's this almost communal experience that you're drawing together. And I wondered if you wanted to talk a little bit about the reading and the sheer, I guess I'm trying not to use the word consumption, but the way that you sort of inhaled.
I think consumption, yeah, it was... So the writing the rot was very different to writing Dropbear, where while there was like an object that I was working against in a sense of Dropbear, it was the phenomenon of colonisation as it has been literarily constructed by the Australian canon. And there were a lot of poems in Dropbear that were just about like sitting with myself, sitting with country, sitting with language, sitting with culture, sitting with history. With the rot, almost everything is just sitting with the stuff that I was absorbing, whether it was books or media, and then the kind of the double time of inspecting this very new archive of that. I started like frantically saving articles and videos, especially videos that were coming out of Gaza, and to my horror, things were disappearing really, really quickly. And I think there's this assumption that we have that the internet is forever, but there's also something called the dead internet theory, which says that the internet is kind of already dead and it's self-replicating through bots and through AI, large language models, and a lot of what we see on the internet is just this these like hollow blinking signs for something that's already dead, in the way that like a dying star will continue to shine light for, you know, a millennia to come before we even know that it's already gone. And so somehow I assembled this reading list of things that I was looking at when I was trying to write this book, because really the real time of writing this book was a few months, and it wasn't really edited very much. I made my husband read it, and then I paid a friend of mine $300 and gave her a weekend and said, can you just tell me, does any of this really need to go? Can you give me some insight on this? And it probably wouldn't exist even if, you know, circumstances had meant that I could sit with this longer. I would have changed things too much. So while there is a rawness to it in terms of the process, I have to just like accept it as a document of a very strange time. There is a typo in it. I'm still mad about that, but I don't tell people. Yeah, I don't tell people where it is to avoid all of it. Yeah, it really was more of a research process, and I'm not somebody who's ever like, I've never studied creative writing. I don't even think that you necessarily need to. I think just write. But it turns out that I think like I write strongest when I'm writing in dialogue with other works, and that produced this very strange document, and it felt necessary and honest to at least tell people what some of the major things I was absorbing were, in part because I'm like really paranoid that they won't be there anymore. Like, you know, it's not just, you know, this idea of the age of book burning, but we are in an age of book pulping. So a lot of my archive, the archive that I was working alongside, was digital media, and I've turned into a doomsday prepper, and now I'm like convinced, no, it has to be physical media. That's the only way they're actually going to survive any of this. So I'm really glad my parents kept all of their DVDs. It turns out they were the smart ones.
We've talked a little bit about desire, but I do want to allocate a bit of time to talk about love, because they are, of course, two different things. And in both books, both books have a different ways of holding and being held as an action that is performed through the poems. There's incredible tenderness across Dropbear and The Rot. For example, in The Rot, there are 3 sections. The central section is called Fragments on Rotting, but it is flanked by 2 others. The first one is called Holdings, and the third one, Unfoldings. And then in Dropbear, I notice that you often will use brackets or parentheses to hold words, like, and they visually appear like arms kind of encircling. And I wondered about your thoughts on how, you know, while both collections are works of critique and they are works of rage, they also hold the things that are vital to you in your life, and they just pulse with so much love. And I wondered if you could reflect on that across both collections.
Yeah, a couple of years back, Jonathan, my co-editor, co-spouse, wrote an article about Les Murray after Les Murray's death, and John loves Les Murray's work and you know, has a very complicated relationship with it. It feels deeply connected to that work as being somebody who you know, also experiences, you know, tremendous mental health issues and loves the land so much. But Les Murray politically was actually a deeply conservative man, and his views got even more conservative and exclusionary, and the vision of the land that he had was so angry about the idea that anyone could ever tell him that he didn't have just as much right to the country as any Aboriginal person. And when he died, John wrote this really beautiful, well-considered essay about like the wonder of Les Murray's work, but also the brutality of that sentiment and what it erases and the harm that it does. And he wrote it, you know, as we went into a Scott Morrison government, which surprised everyone. And he wrote it, you know, completely debilitated by this rise in conservatism that meant that, you know, even the utopian aspects of Murray's work were paling in comparison to this you know, political reality that you know, of the right that you know, that has actually gotten so much worse. And he wrote this article, and it caused a lot of fuss. A lot of people in Australian literature got pissy at him because he was basically like, let the dead bury the dead. Les Murray did what he did, and it's, you know, he wrote fantastic poems, and he lived a lot longer than most Aboriginal people do in this country. That was how he ended the article, and people got so mad at him. And this one person made a comment that has stuck with me forever, and I've never been, because he actually was not on our side of the issue, but he was like, you can only critique something if you love it. And I was like, no, that's bullshit, and I've never gotten it out of my brain. And I've wrestled with it for years, and the kinds of, because I still fundamentally don't believe it, but I haven't been able to prove it with my own life, why it's wrong. Because, you know, in Dropbear, I was wrestling with the political, you know, the political material effect of nationalist ephemera and a nationalist narrative that was about erasing Aboriginality, but that had produced this aesthetic culture that I somehow still loved in weird ways. In The Rot, like, I love life. I actually do. Like, I'm a depressed girly, but I love life and I love people. And I am witnessing scales of global catastrophe that are being propelled by the worst of humanity. And reconciling that is something that I'm never going to be able to be at rest with or to be at peace with. And I've come up against the limitation of goodwill and the limitation of good faith practices, but I have to keep coming back to them because I don't really know what else we have. There have been so many people, especially in the spaces of the left, who have had ostensibly like really good politics, and they've held these lines on these really important issues, and they have also been such wounding, harmful people. And I have to continue to return to this place that the only way through this is with love. Like, the only way we survive this is if we actually believe that we deserve to continue to live on the land and that we deserve to live with each other and look after each other. It's very easy to just narrativize this idea that, you know, apocalypse is probably good, you know, we need to get rid of the humans and just let the land sort itself out. But that's a false narrative. You know, we are necessary for these ecosystems to recover. We have to take responsibility. We have to intervene into these damaging, wounding, annihilating systems with repair. And the only way that you repair is if you stop wounding each other first. And so trying to find a way towards building like an actual praxis of love, even against my better instincts and my spiteful dead heart, that was something I tried to do in this work. Because again, you know, I really was very clearly thinking of like young people looking at this stuff and trying to not make them too depressed to do anything, and trying to insist on the utility of love as a moral corrective, because I've turned preachy in my old age.
We did start a little bit later, so I have another question, and then we're going to finish with a reading before having a couple of questions from the audience. I did want to ask you about a comment that you made at that Writer as Witness panel at Melbourne Writers Festival last year. which was part of the closing comments for the session. And when I was there, I was like, say more. So now I'm going to get you to say more, which is where you said that we often talk about creative practice in this almost quasi sort of spiritual sense, like there's a mystical quality to how a work appears and the form that it takes. But this particular framing neglects all the intentionality behind the work, its conscious design, its purpose. And I wondered how important it is to dispel this fantasy that art is mystical, originating somewhere beyond the artist, because it removes all the purpose that has gone into that work.
Yeah, so I definitely would have made that comment as a part of my ongoing beef against the idea that some people are just born innately talented. I don't believe that that's true. I think that a lot of good art, and I don't even really believe in good art, I just believe in art that finds the people that it's for. But let's use that term, for its most direct purposes here. But like a lot of good art is a combination of, capacity and circumstance. So I truly, truly believe that like Dropbear was a book that I wrote with the resources that I had, and I, to the best of the capacity that I had, to do justice by something that was important to talk about, which was that erasure of the actual truth of this place, of Aboriginal history, and our continued presence. I know the labour that went into that, and I know the years of research and writing and thinking and reflecting, and I know that I couldn't have done it if I hadn't started learning Bundjalung. I know that I couldn't have done it if I hadn't been raised by parents who worked in public education and who valued story and who knew that culture needed to be with us forever in our whole lives, even if they didn't even know what that would eventuate into. I don't think the balance of like the best of the capacity that I had to do justice by, the things I wanted to say was matched by the resources that I had at the time, because my publishing timeline, was cut in half very, very swiftly due to external circumstances that we don't need to get into, but we had to rush this one out or else it probably wasn't going to get published at all for reasons you can speculate on. But I think it's really important, especially in the period that we're in right now, especially looking towards a new arts policy for Creative Australia, which is the major funding body in this country, and really does set the terms of the context for how art is produced and how artists are paid. We aren't valuing the work, the labour that goes into the production of art. We aren't valuing the industry. It's one of the biggest employers in the country, and most people working in this space are working extensively for free and doing an enormous amount of volunteer, unpaid labour in a way that functionally does actually serve to devalue our labour. And I'm part of the problem, because I'll frequently be like, no, you don't need to pay me, I'll just do that. And we all want to, and we propel these industries through passion, even though that still ultimately does, someone benefits from that, and someone benefits from the commitment of our passion. As we produce, as we produce work for each other, because we care about each other and we care about stories. And it's one of the really nice things about humans, that we continue to do it even if it does not serve us as it really should, and it does not always nourish us as it should. But I suppose a lot of us don't really know how to do anything else with our lives and the time that we have in this version of our lives. So I, despite being like a very culturally situated person who does believe, I believe in a lot of stuff in terms of like story coming to you through ancestors, through country, through place. I don't want to devalue the importance of craft, and in building your craft and in practicing it and continuing to shape it through that labour. And I wish we lived in a society that valued that artistry for what it actually is worth and for what it gives to each other. and doesn't just treat it as this like thing that you can do if you want to disappoint your parents.
We talked about love earlier, and I'd really like to finish on love as well. Would you be happy to read a poem called I Will Love, and maybe introduce us just very briefly to the poet that it's dedicated to, June Jordan?
So June Jordan was this incredible black, I believe Indo-Caribbean, like diasporic black poet working predominantly in New York, who was a part of this deeply activist generation of poets who was like fighting front line. She had connections and ties to Black Panthers and to all sorts of global struggles. And I was aware of her work for a really long time, but early, and I feel like it was like 10 days into the genocide in Gaza commencing in its fullest form in 2023, someone posted her poem Intifada Incantation, which is this series of like incredible repetitions of like, I want love in the world and like I want genocide to stop. And it cut through a lot of terror and noise and horror. And this was also around the referendum, and I was so mad and betrayed and horrified, and that poem just like seared through me. And so I sat, and this was technically I was thinking of like writing a book, but I didn't ever know what that was going to mean in any meaningful sense until like quite many months later, and I was like, okay, no, I'm writing a book now. But this was a really key origin point, reading that work. And I wanted to write this poem. This was the hardest poem to write because I didn't believe in it the majority of the time I was writing it, and I was writing it to convince myself that this is something that can do what it needs to do. So this is called I Will Love, after June Jordan. When the last flag falls, it will be death or love. You will no more endure the well-intentioned, nor wait for tears to dry. Pray the nightmare is eloquent from their lunar module ships, counting windmills of ghost funds, all the crushed nests of sea lungs in their eyes. You have examined your fibres to know you are wholly of love. You will not placate the complacent, nor withhold your stumbled, fragile rage. You are not made to break bread with motherfuckers, but to make yourself the threat of love. This life bade you confess crimes of rulers like a peppered moth evolving its dust, while you stood a smothered candle in the burning church, mouthing the answerless demands you were asked to ask each side of a closing door. Here now, in the tailwind of the trespass, decide it will be love. Have no fear for the limit of your grasp, no worry for the breach of mercy or shame to dilute desire. Have love. When there's no one to absolve, they will say they love them all. Every sorry angel, each hallowed shroud, the carnage scrubbed clean from the square. In your survival, you are rinsing grief until the water runs clear, ordaining the pyre for a desert burnt in your name. It will be easy to concede to incentivized collapse, but perhaps you will bite the glass, kick up your feet, spit in their eye and love. Hair long or none, and only roses with thorns, be loved like salt, a thirst in the dry, a keen in the bite, a tongue, a cheek, a love loved, as if it were not weak to take yours in love, to let it claw you back in the dark. You will tire and hunger and love. You will grow old, skin to thin and bones to crack. Whatever beauty you learnt before you could refuse will be born back. You will keep lights you made for yourself, grow seed in the ash from this rot, grow love. Suffer a million little tragedies, hold the nail of a million little griefs. You will love each one with more room for love. Swear it, commit this to your flesh. Until love kills you, you will love. Until love kills you, you will love.
Thank you so much. We have time for a couple of questions, and then
Or heckles.
And then we have all of the shortlisted and, of course, the winner from this year's Stella Prize available to purchase through my colleague at the Book Bird. Sam is in the corner waiting for you. And they will also be available to loan from the library. But do we have any questions? We have a microphone that will come to you. Yeah, just for the recording.
Yeah. They've got such lovely speakers here. It feels like we have to use them.
Is it on already? Is it on already? Yes, sorry. Thank you. That was so wonderful. I'm asking you from the perspective of a literature teacher who is teaching a unit called Voices of Country to my 16 and 17-year-old students. And I'm curious about your thoughts of the dilemma I have, and probably a lot of other teachers have, of whether to dive into texts, dive into poems, dive into short stories, dive into artworks, and let students discover the words in the text and discover what they want to do, or whether to preface First Nations writers and poets and artists with the history that many young students don't know. That I think there's a real tension there in sort of what to do first, and I'd just be really interested in what your opinion is about that.
No, and that's such a fantastic question, and I've had experiences of doing either with different age groups, and it produces such different effects, and that's something that I guess has to be balanced against the conversation of, obviously the curriculum determines the educational outcomes, but thinking about how literature is intended to grow people and to build these experiences, it's so true that too much framing can really take the life out of a work. I taught a workshop the other day, and it's a workshop that I normally teach. I developed this workshop to teach Year 9 boys, right? I was in a festival environment, and they were like, "Oh, we're just going to give you this group," and I was like, "Oh God, they do not want me. You have made a terrible error." And so I wrote a workshop that was about basically a lot of the way that I teach poetry is just about teaching poems that are responding to each other and getting students to look at that, and trying to get students to articulate what they like about poetry. You're not meant to do that. You're not meant to, ask for subjective feedback. But I find that actually drawing them into an aesthetic appreciation for a work is usually more productive than anything else I've ever tried to get them to do. And then I suddenly awkwardly discovered that actually everyone attending that workshop was fully an adult the other day. So I had to just sort of, scrap a lot. And I was looking at these poems in conversation, and was asking the people in the room similar questions to what I ask children, in terms of affect and in terms of, connotations and what connections they could make. And this woman, and I didn't get any further details from her, but I do think she was Palawa. I'd asked, everyone was theorising about what this might mean and the sentiments going on. And I was just like, okay, but what does it taste like? Can you tell me what you think this poem might taste like here? And that's normally a question I just ask people just to throw them, just to see if we can displace the intellectualising sensibility. And she thought about it for a second, and she was like, I think it tastes like kelp. I think it tastes bitter and chewy. And that totally, I lost control of the workshop at that point. Because I was just in there buzzing, and I was like, oh my God, that's so amazing. And someone said, but I had to pretend I was being chill, and I was like, that's so interesting, let's dive into that. And I was like, I'm going to talk about this for the rest of my life. That experience, so if you'd asked me the question a few days ago, I think especially in the context of truth-telling, And we've had the Europe Justice Commission, which has unveiled so many horrors that I don't think I think even a lot of blackfellas were sitting there really sort of profoundly changed from hearing a lot of that evidence articulated in such a way. I think the necessity of truth-telling is so incredibly important, but what are we asking literature to do in this context? And I think if we can evoke feeling and if we can create the structures that mean that even if the students aren't getting all of that information and truth-telling right now in the context of a subject, they're going to know what it tastes like when they hear those facts. I think that is a better thing that we can do as educators than anything else. I worry so much with AI that we are eroding the systems of thought and critical thinking and perception. And, there are other ways to build like a factual knowledge, but that structure, that architecture, the bones that it has to all be, that it all has to be hung off. I think we can ask literature to do that, and it takes affect, and it takes the body and the nervous system more than it takes the intellectual, I think, sometimes. But thank you, because I have no idea how people teach my stuff, and that unit. I'm aware that my work's been put in that curriculum, and I've seen some of the resources people have produced out of that, and God, I love teachers, because not everything in those resources I would say that I would have said about the work myself. But that's the point, right? The author's dead, probably.
We've probably actually come up against our time limit, but Evelyn will be signing copies of her books. So if you do have a burning question, do avail yourself of the book selling services and go have a chat with Evelyn following the conversation. Thank you so much for coming to Geelong and being here with us tonight. We really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you for having me. Thank you to the library. You guys are great. Yeah, Geelong Regional Libraries. Love your building. And thank you, Charlotte.